I never thought I'd be the kind of man to fall victim to betrayal, much less at the hands of the woman I trusted completely. Life, though, it has a cruel sense of humor, doesn't it? It finds ways to humble even the faithful, leaving them broken and questioning everything they once believed in. It started out like any other afternoon. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over our backyard. I was crouched near the oak tree, pulling weeds from the flower beds that had grown wild after weeks of neglect. The air smelled sweet with freshly cut grass, and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower filled the silence. For all intents and purposes, it was peaceful. Normal. But while I worked outside, oblivious to anything beyond the soil beneath my fingernails, my wife was inside doing something far less innocent. She was tending to her own garden, but not one of flowers or shrubs. No, hers was a different kind of cultivation altogether. The oak tree stood tall and proud, its sprawling branches casting dappled shadows across the yard. It had been there long before we moved into the house, a silent witness to countless moments both mundane and monumental. Beneath its bark were tiny carvings from years past, initials scratched during lazy summer afternoons, dates etched beside them like promises written in stone. Promises I now know are meaningless. As I worked, my hands caked with dirt, I couldn't help but notice how overgrown everything had become. Weeds choked the flower beds where roses once bloomed so vibrantly they seemed almost unreal. Their petals used to match her lipstick, the same deep crimson she wore on our wedding day. Funny how memories cling to objects, even when people don't. People always said I was too trusting, too willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. You wear your heart on your sleeve, my mother would say whenever someone inevitably took advantage of me. But trust isn't a weakness, it's a choice. Or so I told myself. Over time, though, I began to wonder if choosing to believe in someone's goodness wasn't just another form of naivety. Maybe that's why I didn't question things when she started coming home late. When her phone stayed perpetually face down on the kitchen counter. When the faint scent of cologne lingered on her clothes despite her insistence that it came from clients at work. Clients who never called during the day, only ever after hours. Are you still out here? Her voice broke through my thoughts, light and airy, like nothing was wrong. She leaned against the back doorframe, arms crossed loosely over her chest. Even in casual jeans and a faded t-shirt, she looked effortlessly put together, her blonde hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. Yeah, I replied, brushing soil off my palms. Figured I'd tackle these weeds before they completely took over. She smiled faintly, though something about it felt distant. Forced. Well, don't exhaust yourself. Dinner will be ready soon. Thanks. I watched her retreat inside, noting the way her shoulders tensed as she closed the door behind her. Something was off, I could feel it nagging at the edges of my mind, but I pushed the thought aside. After all, what did I know? I was just the guy pulling weeds while she handled the rest. Once upon a time, we were unstoppable. High school sweethearts turned college lovers turned spouses bound by vows neither of us thought we'd ever break. Our first apartment smelled like paint fumes and cheap furniture polish, but it was ours. Every creaky floorboard, every drafty window, we claimed them all with laughter and dreams of a future neither of us could have imagined would crumble. Back then, she used to joke that I was her anchor, grounding her when life threatened to sweep her away. Now, looking back, I wonder if anchors aren't meant to sink ships eventually. The day she hired him, I didn't think much of it. Claire had always been particular about appearances, our house, our clothes, even the way we entertained guests. She liked things neat, orderly, polished. So when she announced over breakfast that she'd found someone to help with the yard, I nodded absently, my attention focused more on the newspaper than her words. He comes highly recommended, she said, buttering her toast with deliberate care. Apparently, he transformed Mrs. Henderson's garden last summer. You remember how awful it looked before? Now it's practically a botanical masterpiece. I glanced up briefly, my eyes flickering toward her face. Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, but there was something else lurking beneath the surface, a spark of excitement she couldn't quite conceal. At the time, I chalked it up to enthusiasm for the project. Looking back, I realize now it was something far less innocent. "Sounds good," I muttered, sipping my coffee. "As long as he doesn't charge too much." She laughed lightly, though the sound felt brittle somehow. "Oh, don't worry about the cost. I've already taken care of it." That should have been my first clue. Claire rarely handled finances without consulting me. We shared everything, or so I thought. But in that moment, I let it slide. What harm could a gardener possibly do? That day, I went inside to grab a drink, leaving behind the half-finished flower bed and my growing unease. That's when I heard it, muffled laughter drifting through the house, followed by hushed voices. They weren't trying very hard to hide their conversation, which only made it worse. My heart pounded as I crept down the hallway, bare feet pressing into the cool hardwood floor. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, spilling a sliver of light into the dim corridor. Through the gap, I saw shadows moving, her shadow, unmistakable, swaying in a way that left no room for doubt. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. When reality finally hit me, it wasn't a punch, it was a sledgehammer. My heart didn't just break, it shattered into jagged pieces, sharp enough to cut anyone who dared touch them. Rage surged through me, white-hot and consuming, but somehow, I managed to hold it back. Instead of bursting in, I turned and walked away. I went back outside, picked up my gardening shears, and pretended nothing was wrong. To anyone watching, I must have looked like a fool. But I wasn't stupid. And I sure as hell wasn't weak. For the rest of the afternoon, I worked in silence, methodically trimming bushes and pulling weeds with mechanical precision. Each snip of the shears felt like a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim control over something, anything, in a world that suddenly seemed chaotic and cruel. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Claire emerged eventually, her face flushed, her hair tousled. She glanced at me briefly before turning her attention to the gardener, who was packing up his tools near the shed. Her smile was bright, almost radiant, but there was a nervous edge to it, as if she sensed I knew something was off. "How's it going out here?" she asked, her voice overly cheerful. "Fine," I replied curtly, not looking up from my work. "Looks like you've got everything under control." She hesitated, clearly thrown by my tone. "Is something wrong?" "Nope." I forced a tight smile, though my jaw clenched so hard it ached. "Everything's perfect." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't press further. Instead, she busied herself helping him load equipment into his truck, a task she'd never shown interest in before today. Every movement they shared felt deliberate, intimate, even though neither spoke a word. It was as if they communicated through glances and gestures alone, a silent language I could never hope to understand. When the gardener finally drove away, Claire lingered in the driveway, watching until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did she return to the house, avoiding eye contact as she passed me. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. We sat across from each other at the table, picking at our food without appetite. The air between us crackled with unspoken accusations and simmering anger. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear apart the fragile illusion she clung to so desperately. But I held back, knowing instinctively that now wasn't the time. Instead, I focused on small details, the way her fork scraped against her plate, the faint tremor in her hands as she reached for her glass of water, the hollow look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. These were signs of guilt, plain and simple. Yet still, I said nothing. After dinner, she retreated to the living room, curling up on the couch with a book she barely glanced at. I joined her after cleaning up, settling into my usual spot in the armchair. For a while, we coexisted in uneasy silence, the television humming softly in the background. Finally, she broke the quiet. "You've been acting strange all day," she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you mad about something?" I shook my head, feigning indifference. "Not at all. Just tired, I guess." "You seem distant." "Do I?" I shrugged, keeping my tone neutral. "Maybe I'm just thinking too much." She studied me for a moment, searching my face for clues. Whatever she found, or failed to find, must have reassured her, because she relaxed slightly, leaning back against the cushions. "I love you, Ryan," she murmured, almost absent-mindedly. "You know that, right?" The word stung more than any insult could have. Love? What kind of twisted game was she playing? How dare she utter those 3 syllables with such casual ease, as if they meant nothing? "I know," I replied stiffly, rising to my feet. "Good night, Claire." As I climbed the stairs to bed, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This wasn't the fiery confrontation I'd imagined earlier. There would be no shouting matches, no dramatic revelations tonight. Instead, I chose silence, a weapon far more devastating than anger. Lying awake in the darkness, I replayed every interaction, every glance, every whispered word. My mind refused to rest, churning endlessly as I tried to piece together the fragments of my crumbling marriage. Why had she done it? Was it boredom? Loneliness? Or was it something deeper, something rooted in who we were, or weren't, as a couple? Memories flooded back, unbidden and unwelcome. Our first date, laughing until tears streamed down our faces. The proposal, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The countless mornings spent side by side, drinking coffee and planning our future. All those moments, once cherished, now felt tainted, poisoned by betrayal. And yet, amidst the pain, there was clarity. In letting go of the illusions I'd clung to, I began to see things as they truly were. Claire wasn't the woman I thought I married. Maybe she never had been. Perhaps I'd built her up in my mind, creating an idealized version of perfection that no one could possibly live up to, including her. But acceptance didn't bring peace. If anything, it deepened the ache in my chest, reminding me of everything I stood to lose. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Things couldn't continue like this, not for me, and certainly not for her. Whether she realized it or not, she deserved better than a husband consumed by suspicion and resentment. And I deserved better than a wife who couldn't be honest with me. I waited until she left for work, slipping out quietly once her car pulled out of the driveway. Inside the house, I moved through the rooms with purpose, gathering belongings I'd need for the next few days. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal items, all packed neatly into a suitcase. Then, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Claire. I don't know where to start. By the time you read this, I'll already be gone. Not forever, but long enough for both of us to figure out what comes next. What I saw yesterday, I can't unsee it. And maybe I should confront you, force you to explain yourself. But honestly, I'm too tired. Too hurt. Too angry. So instead, I'm walking away. Not because I want to give up, but because I need space to think, to decide whether this is something I can forgive. Please don't try to reach me. I'll contact you when I'm ready. Take care of yourself. Ryan. Placing the letter on the counter, I took one last look around the house, the home we'd built together, and stepped outside. As I drove away, the weight on my shoulders lifted slightly, replaced by a strange mixture of relief and dread. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: life as I knew it was over. Over the next few days, I watched them closely. Studied their movements. Learned their secrets. They thought they were clever, sneaking around behind my back while I stayed out of sight. But they underestimated me. Underestimated the depth of my anger, and my patience. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to keep tabs on Claire and her gardener. Each morning, I returned to our neighborhood under the guise of running errands or visiting friends, parking discreetly down the street where I could observe the house without being seen. Binoculars became my constant companion, allowing me to track their every move with clinical precision. It wasn't hard to piece together their routine. He arrived at the same time each day, always mid-morning when the sun was high and the neighbors least likely to notice. She greeted him warmly, often lingering by the gate or offering him coffee before they began working. Sometimes, they disappeared inside the house for extended periods, to discuss plans, she claimed when questioned later. Other times, they lingered outside, laughing softly over shared jokes no one else understood. Every interaction fueled my rage, sharpening it into something cold and calculating. Their carelessness infuriated me, not just because of what they were doing, but because they believed they could get away with it. That they thought I wouldn't find out. Or worse, that I'd forgive them if I did. But forgiveness wasn't part of my vocabulary anymore. Not after everything I'd lost. The property we lived on was big, old, and full of forgotten corners. One of those corners was the well at the far end of the yard, hidden behind the sagging shed. It was ancient, unused for decades, its mouth covered with rotting boards. Deep, dark, and silent, it seemed almost symbolic now, a place where things could disappear without a trace. Just like she had made me feel. On one of my reconnaissance trips, I ventured closer to inspect it. The wood creaked ominously beneath my weight as I knelt to peer inside. Darkness swallowed the beam of my flashlight, revealing nothing but empty space stretching endlessly downward. A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but from possibility. This was it. The perfect solution. A plan began to form in my mind, vague at first but growing clearer with each passing day. At first, I dismissed it as madness, a fleeting fantasy born of grief and betrayal. But the idea refused to leave me alone, festering like an open wound until it consumed every waking thought. By the time I was ready, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Step 1 was gathering supplies. Late at night, when the streets were deserted and prying eyes non-existent, I visited hardware stores and online marketplaces, purchasing items that raised no eyebrows individually but took on sinister meaning when assembled together. Rope, duct tape, gloves, a sturdy tarp, all carefully stored in the trunk of my car, waiting for their purpose. Next came reconnaissance. I memorized their schedules, noting when Claire left for work and when he typically finished his tasks. I mapped escape routes through the woods surrounding our property, ensuring I'd have a clear path should anything go wrong. Every detail mattered, every contingency had to be accounted for. Most importantly, I practiced restraint. Patience was key. If I acted too soon or let emotion cloud my judgment, the entire plan would unravel. So I waited, biding my time until the moment felt right. Until they grew complacent, believing themselves untouchable. As the days passed, I barely recognized myself. Gone was the trusting, naive man who once believed love could conquer all. In his place stood someone colder, harder, someone capable of unthinkable acts. Sleep eluded me, replaced by restless nights spent envisioning scenarios and outcomes. Food tasted bland, meaningless. Even conversations with acquaintances felt hollow, as though I existed in a world separate from everyone else. At times, doubt crept in. Was this really who I wanted to become? Could revenge truly heal the wounds they'd inflicted? Yet whenever these questions surfaced, I silenced them with memories of her laughter echoing through the hallway, her shadow swaying against the bedroom wall. Those images hardened my resolve, reminding me why I couldn't walk away. Revenge wasn't about justice, it was about control. About taking back the power they'd stolen from me. And if that meant crossing lines I'd never imagined approaching, so be it. The night I put my plan into motion, she had no idea what was coming. She had just stepped out of the shower, her hair damp and clinging to her neck, wrapped in that silk robe I used to adore. I approached her calmly, speaking softly, telling her I wanted to talk. "Fresh air," I said. A walk outside would clear our heads. She followed me without suspicion, her bare feet whispering against the grass. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the yard. We walked past the oak tree, past the shed, until we reached the well. I kept my voice gentle, soothing, lulling her into a false sense of security. When we were close enough to the edge, I stopped and turned to face her. For a brief moment, she looked confused, perhaps sensing something was off. But it was too late. Before she could react, I acted. With precision born of fury, I pushed her toward the gaping hole. There was no scream, no struggle, only the dull thud of her body hitting the bottom, swallowed whole by the darkness below. The world seemed to hold its breath after that moment. The only sounds were the crickets chirping in the distance and the faint rustling of leaves overhead. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, but my hands remained steady, almost unnaturally so. I stared down into the abyss, half expecting some kind of response, a cry for help, a plea for mercy, but there was nothing. Just an oppressive silence that pressed against me like a physical weight. I knelt beside the well, peering into its depths as if searching for answers. What had I done? The question echoed in my mind, unbidden and relentless. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to her. Not like this. Yet here I stood, consumed by a rage that had spiraled beyond control, leaving destruction in its wake. A strange emptiness settled over me then, replacing the adrenaline rush with a hollow numbness. It wasn't relief or satisfaction, it was detachment, as though I'd stepped outside myself and become an observer rather than a participant. The man who had once loved Claire, trusted her, built a life with her, he felt like someone else now. Someone I barely recognized. Practicality took over next. I couldn't afford to linger, every second increased the risk of discovery. Moving quickly, I dismantled the scene, erasing any evidence of what had transpired. The rotting boards covering the well were replaced, secured tightly to ensure they wouldn't shift under scrutiny. Footprints in the dirt were smoothed away, blending seamlessly with the natural texture of the ground. Inside the house, I methodically cleaned up anything that might raise suspicion. Her phone lay abandoned on the kitchen counter, its screen dark and silent. I powered it off, slipping it into my pocket alongside mine. Her laptop, still open on the dining table, contained emails and messages I didn't want falling into the wrong hands. I wiped it clean, resetting it to factory settings before stashing it in the trunk of my car. By dawn, the house appeared untouched, a pristine shell hiding the horrors within. Only the well bore witness to the truth, and even then, it kept its secrets buried deep. In the days that followed, I adopted a mask of normalcy, pretending everything was fine while the weight of my actions pressed heavily upon me. Neighbors asked about Claire's absence, expressing concern when I claimed she'd gone out of town unexpectedly. Work emergency, I explained, forcing a smile that felt brittle and foreign. They nodded sympathetically, unaware of the monster living among them. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, images of that night replayed in vivid detail, the look of confusion on her face, the sound of her body hitting the water, the suffocating silence afterward. Food tasted like ash, conversations felt robotic, and each passing hour stretched endlessly, dragging me further into despair. Yet despite the guilt gnawing at my insides, a part of me refused to regret what I'd done. She had betrayed me, shattered the foundation of our marriage, and left me with nothing but pain and disillusionment. If anyone deserved punishment, it was her. Wasn't it? But logic offered little comfort. No matter how I justified it, one undeniable fact remained: I had taken a life. And not just any life, hers. The woman I once swore to love and protect until death parted us. Instead, I had been the instrument of her demise. Months had passed since I left the house behind, severing ties with the life I once knew. The new apartment I rented was small, sterile, and impersonal, a stark contrast to the sprawling home filled with memories both joyful and painful. Here, no creaky floorboards whispered secrets, no oak trees bore witness to promises broken. It was a fresh start, or at least, that's what I told myself. But starting over isn't as simple as changing locations. No matter how far I ran, the past clung to me like a shadow, refusing to be outrun. Nights were the hardest. Sleep eluded me, replaced by restless hours spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that night in excruciating detail. Her face haunted my dreams, sometimes smiling sweetly, other times twisted in fear or accusation. Each image cut deeper than the last, leaving scars invisible to the world but etched permanently into my psyche. During the day, I adopted routines designed to keep my mind occupied. Long walks through crowded streets, aimless browsing in bookstores, endless cups of coffee consumed alone at corner cafes, all served as distractions from the emptiness gnawing at my core. Yet even amidst the noise and chaos of city life, silence found me. And when it did, there was no escape from the truth: I had taken a life. Not just any life, but hers, the woman who had once been my entire world. One evening, as I sat nursing a drink at a dimly lit bar, a familiar face appeared on the television mounted above the counter. The news anchor's voice droned softly in the background, barely audible over the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. But something about her tone caught my attention, prompting me to glance up. "Authorities are investigating the disappearance of Claire Bennett," she said, her expression grave. The 34-year-old mother of two vanished without a trace several months ago after reportedly leaving her home for a work-related trip. A photo flashed across the screen, a candid shot of Claire smiling brightly, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. My stomach churned as I stared at it, unable to look away. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the bar fading into a blur around me. All I could see was her face, frozen in eternal optimism, oblivious to the fate awaiting her. The report continued, detailing efforts to locate her, interviews with friends and family expressing concern and disbelief. They described her as kind, loving, devoted, a woman who would never abandon those she cared about. Lies. Every word felt like a slap, twisting the knife already lodged in my chest. I downed the rest of my drink in one swallow, signaling the bartender for another. As the alcohol burned its way down my throat, I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. She was gone now, erased from their lives as thoroughly as she'd been erased from mine. What difference did it make if they believed her innocent? The truth wouldn't change anything, not for them, not for me. But deep down, I knew better. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply you bury it. And when it did, I doubted I'd survive intact. Weeks later, he came back into my life. At first, I thought it was coincidence, a fleeting glimpse of him crossing the street outside my building, heading toward a nearby cafe. I dismissed it, assuming he lived nearby and hadn't recognized me. After all, why would he? Then it happened again. And again. Each sighting sent a jolt of panic coursing through me, followed quickly by anger. Was he following me? Testing me? Or worse, did he know? Finally, one rainy afternoon, I confronted him. He stood beneath the awning of a bookstore, scrolling idly through his phone while raindrops splattered against the pavement. Taking a deep breath, I approached cautiously, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low but firm. He glanced up, startled, recognition flickering across his face. "Ryan? I know you've been watching me," I accused, ignoring his attempt at casualness. "Why?" For a moment, he hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Then, with a resigned sigh, he gestured toward the cafe next door. "Let's go inside." We sat across from each other in a quiet corner booth, the rain tapping rhythmically against the windows. He studied me intently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I know what happened to Claire," he said simply, his tone devoid of accusation but heavy with certainty. My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Don't play dumb, he replied, leaning forward slightly. I saw you that night, the way you looked at her, the tension between you two. Something wasn't right. And then she disappeared. She left, I snapped, forcing conviction into my voice despite the tremor threatening to betray me. She got scared and ran. He shook his head slowly, pity softening his features. That's not what happened, and you know it. For a moment, silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, against my better judgment, I confessed. Not everything, not the details of her death or the role I played, but enough to confirm his suspicions. I loved her, I admitted, my voice breaking. And she destroyed me. What was I supposed to do? His gaze hardened, sympathy giving way to disgust. You don't get to decide someone's worth based on how they hurt you. You crossed a line, Ryan. One you can't come back from. His words hit like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. He was right, I knew it even before he said it. But hearing it aloud made it real in a way I couldn't ignore. When he stood to leave, I reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm. Please, I begged, desperation clawing at my throat. Don't tell anyone. He pulled free, shaking his head. It's not my secret to keep. But whether I say something or not, trust me, this will eat you alive. With that, he walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked streets. I sat there for hours afterward, watching the droplets streak down the windowpane, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a shroud. Days turned into weeks, and still, nothing happened. No police knocking on my door, no reporters camped outside my apartment. Life continued as if nothing had changed, though I existed in a state of perpetual dread, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, one morning, it did. Officers arrived early, rousing me from a fitful sleep with urgent knocks on the door. Their badges gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as they read me my rights, handcuffing me before leading me outside. Cameras flashed, capturing my stunned expression as neighbors gawked from behind drawn curtains. At the station, I confessed everything. There was no point denying it, they had evidence tying me to the scene, witnesses placing me near the well that fateful night. Besides, the burden of carrying the truth alone had grown unbearable. Speaking it aloud felt like releasing a pressure valve, even if it meant surrendering what little freedom I had left. The trial was swift and merciless. Prosecutors painted me as a monster, driven by jealousy and rage to commit unspeakable acts. Defense attorneys argued diminished capacity, citing emotional distress and psychological trauma. In the end, none of it mattered. The jury deliberated briefly before delivering their verdict, guilty on all counts. As the judge sentenced me to life without parole, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely, knowing the nightmare was finally over. Whether justice had been served or not, I couldn't say. All I knew was that I deserved whatever punishment awaited me. Prison offered a grim sort of clarity. Stripped of distractions, forced to confront myself daily, I began to understand the full extent of my actions. Guilt weighed heavily upon me, shaping every thought, every decision, every interaction. Some days, it felt like drowning, others, like penance. Claire's memory lingered, haunting me in ways I couldn't escape. Sometimes, I imagined seeing her in the distance, her figure blurred by shadows and smoke. Other times, I heard her voice whispering softly, urging me to seek forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't mine to claim, not from her, not from anyone. In the end, I realized the truth: love and hate aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin, intertwined so tightly they become indistinguishable. Claire taught me that lesson, albeit unintentionally. Through her betrayal, she showed me the depths of human emotion, the capacity for passion, devotion, and destruction. Would I have done things differently if given the chance? Probably not. Love makes fools of us all, driving us to extremes we never thought possible. Betrayal turns us into monsters, capable of unimaginable acts in the name of revenge. And so, I remain here, locked away from the world, paying for my sins in solitude. Redemption may elude me forever, but perhaps that's fitting. After all, some wounds run too deep to heal.